What I love about slow shutter photography is that it doesn't just show you how something looks like, it shows you the energy of the moment. And that's something that fast shutter speeds cannot capture. But getting these shots isn't just about using a slow shutter speed. It's about knowing how, when, and why to use these techniques to underline the story of your photo with movement or energy. Because after all, as photographers, we are visual storytellers. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the settings and 4 techniques for slow shutter photography that I've learned over the last 5 years as a photographer. And one of them is super overlooked even on YouTube tutorials on slow shutter photography. But let's start with the classic first. Panning shots are probably the method for slow shutter photography that is the most commonly known. So let's have a look at how you can get these shots. So firstly, you want to find the right shutter speed. And that kind of depends on how fast your subject is. But as a rule of thumb, try 1/30th of a second, or try a shutter speed between 1/30th of a second and 1/5 of a second. So if your subject is quite fast, like a car, for example, or a cyclist, you can use 1/30th and still get enough motion blur to have everything around your subject be kind of blurry. So what you then try to do is to move your camera with your subject from side to side. And the key here is to use a high speed burst mode to make sure that you get at least 1 or 2 decent shots of all the shots that you're trying to take while following your subject. Okay, I usually shoot in manual mode, so I set my shutter speed somewhere between 1/5 and 1/30th of a second, and then I adjust my aperture and my ISO depending on how bright the scene is. If it's very dark, I use a low aperture to make sure enough light comes into my lens and my camera. And if I don't have enough light, I'll increase the ISO as a last option to make up for the lack of light. Okay, I usually use autofocus or manual focus when it comes to focusing for panning shots. So if I'm shooting very fast objects, I tend to either use zone focus, meaning that I just tap on the screen of my camera and that sets a focus point for the camera to focus on. And then if you press your camera's shutter only halfway down, not all the way down, it'll focus on that point, and then I'll wait until my subject reaches the point. I follow it and I shoot in burst mode. If you don't have that option, you can use manual focus, of course. Okay, one very important tip here is to keep your subject on the same position of your composition throughout the entire panning shot series. This will help you to kind of get a couple of shots where your subject is in focus, because a lot of the times you will miss the subject, not just your focus when it comes to the distance, but also when it comes to the speed, because it's actually difficult to match the speed of your subject and get it right. So don't be frustrated if it doesn't work on your first couple of tries. Just keep practicing and know that it happens to all of us. So for example, if you turn on the grid, like the rule of thirds grid in your camera, this will make it a little bit easier to find out where your subject is within the composition and then try to keep it there. Okay, so much for panning shots, but what if we switch it up and instead of having everything blurry but our subject, we turn it around and we try to have everything in focus except for our subject. So let's have a look at a couple of examples to really understand why this can work. So what is helpful here is to firstly find an environment where there is a lot of movement, like for example train stations where people rush to get their train. In this case, you can use a stationary object like a train that is standing and use a slower shutter speed, so the people entering the train get kind of blurry. And this is just more of a creative tool that helps you pull the focus away from the individual. Like this photo is not about this specific person entering this train. It's just about someone entering the train. And by removing the details on the person, it just helps us put more focus on the overall composition. And it also kind of underlines the movement and this whole feeling of rushing to get your train. But what I want to talk about here still is that just because we are using a slower shutter doesn't mean we should neglect overall composition rules. Like in this case, I still feel like it works quite well because we at least have some leading lines that lead the subject or that lead towards the subject. So we have these lines on the train car that lead from left to right, and that just makes it kind of easy to follow into the composition and find the subject. By the way, if you're unfamiliar with these different composition methods like framing or leading lines or negative space and all that stuff, I do have a free ebook that you can download for free. Just click the link in the pinned comment and sign up for my email list, and I'll send it to you right away. And I promise I won't spam you. And after that, I'll send you occasional photography tips or challenges. And that's basically it. So yeah, it's free. You can download it if you want. But other than that, the next example that I feel like is a little bit stronger is this one. In this case, our subject is rushing. So they're actually running up. And because we have the context of a train station, or at least some kind of exit, we can underline the feeling of movement and rushing to get to the destination. In this case, I feel like it works way better because the body language of our subject is just really that of someone who's in a hurry, and using a slow shutter captures this feeling way better than using a high shutter would. Because if this moment was just frozen in time perfectly, like using 1/1000th of a second, for example, this photo wouldn't have the same energy. We wouldn't be able to tell how fast this person was going. And by using a slower shutter, like 1/10th, for example, it's just much more helpful to just underline the story of someone trying to catch their train. Okay, next up we have something that I don't hear a lot of people talk about when it comes to motion blur, and that is moving as the photographer while the subject is still. And in this case, these settings vary just a little bit. So in this case, I used 1/60th of a second because I was moving in a train and it was going quite fast. So I didn't have to use a very slow shutter speed, because if I did, I would have had too much motion blur. And what I wanted was to focus on the background. So this skyline of the town and this tower on the right. And I wanted something between my subject and myself to show the motion that was going on. So in this case, I got lucky and I captured some cyclists that were passing by, and using 1/60th was enough. And to be fair, it took like 10 train rides to get this shot right, because it took a lot of practice and a lot of timing to capture something that was interesting in the middle ground between me and the subject. And yeah, it just requires a little bit of practice getting focus right, getting the right supporting subject between me and the main subject. And in this case, 1/60th was enough because I was moving very fast. Okay, last method we have is a still subject and moving surroundings. So this is basically having your subject stand or sit still and having other elements around your subject, like behind it or in front of it, move to show the difference between your still subject and the moving object. So in this case, let's compare two images side by side of the same spot. So on the left side, we have the better image in my eyes that has much more motion blur. And on the right side, we have the same shot without the motion blur. And what I don't like about the right one is that the people are too prominent. There's too much detail on the people that makes it hard for me to focus on the main subject, which is the temple and the architecture of this temple gate in the background. So if we compare that to the left image, I feel like we still have the same amount of people or even more, but they are all kind of blurry. So that makes it very easy for me to subconsciously understand that this photo is not about the people, because there's way less detail in the people. And that helps me kind of focus on my main subject. And secondly, the left image shows much more energy about this place because it was packed. It was in the middle of the day, like, I don't know, 12 or 1 p.m., noon, and everyone was at this place. And slow shutter speeds are just a great way to kind of deal with crowds or with crowded places, because sometimes we just can't get rid of these people, and sometimes we don't have the chance to get up very early, or we don't want to get up very early to photograph certain sites when we're traveling. So using a slower shutter speed is just a creative way and a really helpful way, not only to deal with crowds, but to actually make use of them and use them to your benefit to kind of showcase the energy. And this left photo kind of portrays this reality much better and in a much more pleasant way. Oh, and what is very important here, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, this is the only image I had to use an ND filter for, because on this day it was just super bright. And when you decrease your shutter speed on a very bright day, your image just becomes too bright to be able to see anything. So using an ND filter, which is basically like sunglasses for your lens, you can prevent some of the light from getting in. And this allows you to lower your shutter speed. So this was shot at the maximum aperture, I think, like f/22. So this means little light comes in because the aperture is so high. And additionally, I put on the ND filter to block even more of the light. So I was able to get a slower shutter speed. And I'm using an ND filter from the brand JJC. That is like, I think it was 30 euros. I'll put the name in the description so you can look it up for yourself. And yeah, it's a rather cheap ND filter. It does what it's supposed to. If you go to the maximum darkness, because it's a variable ND filter, if you go to the maximum darkness, you will have some vignette. So the edges of your photo will become dark. So it's by no means a high-end ND filter, but for my intents and purposes, it gets the job done. And I usually only go to like 2/3 of the maximum darkness, because at that point it still works and I don't get these dark edges on my photos. So yeah, it's a cheap alternative that you can consider when looking up ND filters. Okay, and that is it for using slow shutter speed and using them with more intention to underline the story of your photo with movement or energy. If you have any questions left, feel free to just leave me a comment. I'll get back to you. And other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you liked it. Subscribe if you're looking for more photography related tips. And yeah, other than that, I hope this video helps you create with more intention, and I'll see you next Wednesday.